You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This month we're going to be talking about the history of the geisha and Japanese art, along with the ways in which that art relates to Gothic literature and the feminine power of those characters, and how those influences were incorporated into the music of the 80s post-punk scene, and thus the ideologies and aesthetic idioms of goth culture. We'll also be exploring some Japanese philosophy and modern media on this episode. As always, I am the Count, and I'm here with my co-host Trey, and our guest this month is Genevieve. So before we dig into your thesis and the research that you've been doing, just a brief introduction here, so people know you're a brilliant model and a student of philosophy and psychology. And if I can say, you have an intellect that I immensely respect as well. But if you don't mind, giving us sort of, I don't know, a little information on your dark dawning, as it were, or how you sort of first got into goth and why that resonates for you still.
I would say it started when I was really below the years of 10, 9, somewhere like that. And I think it was a repeat of The Damned on Top of the Pops. And they were doing Eloise. And I looked at Davanian and I thought, this is how I want my life to be. And I always kept that with me. Like, I wanted my life to be like that aesthetic forever. And then I always had that sort of leaning, I would say, towards that kind of thing. And when it truly developed and I got into the usuals, Susie, The Cure, Sisters, Southern Death Cult, all that kind of stuff, my dad said that I was not deviating, that I was just being the same old and not widening my artistic intake, if you will. So I started getting into loads of other stuff. I suppose I was just trying to please my parents and not be strange, because I was always told that people were looking at me the wrong way for dressing the way I was and all that kind of thing.
I can relate to that.
I always kept that at my core, and I always went back to the same thing, but I did try to deviate, and I got into things 20s and 30s music and ragtime and all that kind of stuff. I went through a hip hop phase, but yeah, just came back to the same old thing and carried on. I don't know how else to explain my life. But I always dressed outrageously. I mean, I was bullied in school, as I suppose most people were bullied. But yeah, I was bullied relentlessly for looking like a boy and for various other things. So I just kind of thought, well, I don't really think, and just wore what I wanted to. So I was always very strange. So when I discovered the dark aesthetic, it wasn't any problem for me to just go and do whatever to do, regardless of what anybody thought. Aside from my parents, who I tried to please by changing. But alas, I haven't grown out of it.
Where did that love of fashion come from? Because you obviously, from photos and things, you clearly have a refined taste in aesthetics and, avant-garde and bold fashion. Did that sort of develop alongside the music, or was that like a separate passion of yours?
That came from when I was very, very young. I always said I was going to be a model, and then I didn't really grow above 5 foot, so I still haven't. And so therefore I thought, well, I'll be a fashion designer. So I studied fashion design in school and art and design and all that kind of stuff before I changed my path. So I always had an interest in fashion. And maybe that came from Dave Vanian, who's like a constant vein throughout my life.
So you find that we'll get to your paper in a second here. I'm just curious. Did you find that your passion in music and fashion were complementary to
Oh
your sort
yeah,
of identity
absolutely
construction as a goth?
simultaneous. Yeah. Although the music did kind of drop out because I tried very hard to please my parents, and that the look changed with that also because I tried to not be strange and tried to please them. But then as soon as I moved out, left home when I was 17, so I was quite young, and I lived by myself. I moved to the biggest city, which was closest to us, and then I was able to really just branch out and be myself and be as outrageous as I possibly could
Hmm.
be.
Yeah, I certainly remember when I was younger having this longing to be normal, I guess, because I'm not the type of goth who is interested in looking outrageous for attention. It's more of just a, identity expression and sort of um, philosophical presentation of my
Yeah, I would
internal
agree.
workings and musings and things. And I've moved past that, but I can certainly remember just wishing like I wish people just looked at me like I was, normal like everyone else.
Yes, it's a metaphysical recreation of, everything that I've
Yeah.
taken in art, media, literature.
Well, let's get into it. I'll give you the floor and you can begin and explain however you like sort of your research, if you want to start with how that came about or just go right into your thesis and the information in your paper and that kind of thing and explain that for us.
Really, I was trying to just answer a question. I s- I was your average goth, had but Susie Sue hair, Susie Sue makeup, and the usual, which just actually developed naturally. It wasn't like a copy of Susie. It was just a natural development of like was very much into Egyptology when I was younger, and I started wearing my makeup like that.
Mhm.
And then I just eventually drew little bits and added more, and it just turned out the way it was naturally. It was just an evolution, possibly because of my insecurity with my height. I tried to get the biggest hair possible. Um,
Mhm.
also, very large shoes may have stemmed from the same
Mm.
insecurity, but there we are. Um,
Mhm.
so there was that, but then I started wearing my hair in a very different way. I started wearing it in a more sleek, geisha-esque way, and people started commenting and calling me the Geisha Goth. And I thought, is this cultural appropriation? Am I being really insensitive? And so I thought, I'm
Mm.
going to start looking into this. I had always admired the geisha as a character of self-creation and artistry, but I kind of thought, am I being kind of insensitive by wearing this do? So I
Mm.
looked into it and decided to write a paper about it and answer the question, why is there a geisha goth? Why is this a thing? Because I looked it up and it's definitely a thing. Seems to be entrenched. It's everywhere. Once you look at it, it becomes,
Mhm.
a thing that is everywhere that I hadn't really recognized before.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so yeah, in answering the question, what I do is try and look at the aesthetic and philosophical sympathies between Britain and Japan, well, the West in general and Japan, Europe and Japan, all of those. um,
Mm.
and there is an aesthetic sympathy between the two. Um, I do look deeper into the philosophical sympathies between that could exist. It's more of a poetical musing, but that could exist between the geisha and modern Gothic subculture, and why that may have
Mhm.
been picked up, because I don't think anything really exists in a vacuum. I think everything must come from somewhere. Um,
Right.
so
Yeah.
yeah, aesthetically, there's obvious the self creation, the artistry of the whole thing. I mean, the Goths try to express a sort of aesthetic conviction, try to reach that. But I would say the geisha is more like a brushstroke within a larger work of art, that not quite as individualistic as the goth. I know you've
Mm.
discussed individualism before within your politics.
Yeah. Yeah, we did an episode a few years ago on it as well. It does, despite It seems Goths have a love affair with individualism, despite sort of ignoring the way that group interactions come about and sort of engender the group identities and affiliations and familial ties and that sort of thing. It still seems to be one of the venerated virtues of the Goth is this idea or maybe romanticization of individualism. But yeah, how does that? What is the sort of, I guess, philosophy of aesthetic for the geisha? Then is it more of a communal, familial expression through shared, sartorial idioms, or
Well, I'll
how does that work?
probably start with the Gothic. Of course, you've got your homology hypothesis, and within that you have, as I think, what would you call it, a pillar of embracing darkness.
Sure, yeah, or a locus, however you want to, yeah,
So
phrase
you
that.
sort of say that as something which is as specific to Gothic culture, and I do agree
Mm,
with you. Well, obviously, I can't really argue with that. But what I do is I go into the philosophy of painful art, um, because, oh God, where do I begin? Gothic literature, I know you may disagree with this, but I find it's a very robust sort of vein running through Gothic culture. It's not the only one. It's like a petal within
mhm,
the bouquet of flowers of Goth. So I concentrate on that one petal, which is the Gothic literature petal. Oh, great
mm,
analogy. There we go. So, um, so yeah, I concentrate on painful art and why Goths culture has this propensity towards embracing specifically painful art and specifically death within painful art. I would say because within Gothic literature, there's a hell of a lot of death. Obviously, it
mm,
used to be called tragic art, philosophy of tragic art. Sorry. So painful art,
mm,
I think, covers everything because it doesn't just cover tragedy. It covers, Gothic literature, as I would argue, is a very robust vein within Gothic subculture, Goth subculture. But by Gothic literature's very definition, it's an art form that attempts to sculpt tragedy and invoke a frisson of terror within the reader. Tragic art, or as it's otherwise known, painful art, conjures negative emotions such as horror, sadness, dread, but most importantly allows us a curious peek into death. So we can never imagine our own experience of death, and our individual mortality is an elusive black which we cannot ever consciously contain, and it compels us to rummage around maddeningly, wonderful word, for an
mm,
impression of the tangibility of death. So what I'm trying to say is by embracing the darkness within Gothic literature and sort of turning that darkness into sartorial aesthetics, wearing it on
mhm,
the outside,
mhm,
becoming the ghost, if you will. What
mm,
I think people within goth culture who are inclined to, go more expressive on their look and so on and so forth. But you don't have to do it through look. You can do it through any kind of just the art forms you like. A walk in the graveyard. You're embracing death. Yada yada yada. Um,
mhm,
you could say with all the Gothic literature running through the Gothic culture's veins that there is a propensity for Goth culture in making more of a semiotic statement by wearing their contemplation of impermanence, that embracing of death, contemplating death, in this aesthetic conviction that they wear on the outside. So as I said, like by becoming the ghost through this artistic self cultivation, what they're doing is sort of, yeah, by embracing that, by wearing it on the outside, by becoming the ghost, um, they are subverting that sort of fear and anxiety that you find within painful art, um, and embracing it and wearing it,
mm,
and
Is it perhaps a way? Is it perhaps just engaging with these concepts of pain, these engaging with these concepts of suffering, um, allow you to take the power back from those
Yes,
things
that's what I'm trying to
that
say.
control
By
the average person?
subverting the anxiety that's portrayed within uh, methods of painful art, like whether it's Gothic literature or um, film or any other
Mm,
types of media, you're
mhm.
completely subverting that and giving a message, a sort of semiotic message that you're, you know, embracing that against what may be the societal norm, which is not embracing death at all.
Right. Well,
Right. The societal norm appears to try to, you know, recover their own agency by pretending all this bad stuff doesn't exist, so there's nothing to be afraid of. Where you are basically getting rid of the power for it to even affect you by, engaging with it and playing with it in a way that makes it not powerful because it's part of your quotidian existence, as part of your semiotic life.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to stay on the Gothic for a moment since we were there, but since you brought it up most recently, how then does that subversion of cultural norms surrounding death compare, at least from a sort of Eurocentric perspective, compared to Japanese culture? Because from my understanding, and I admit I'm very ignorant of Japanese cultures, but from my understanding, there is more of a sort of ancestor worship and respect of elders and more of a close relationship with death. I don't know
Yeah,
if you can
absolutely.
speak to
Yeah,
that.
the contemplation of impermanence is actually something that they teach within Buddhist
Hmm.
philosophy. That's
Right. Yeah.
an
Okay.
It's
absolute,
the core
yeah,
Buddhist philosophy,
definitely.
really.
And because there's more of an animistic, like a pagan animistic type of tangible world beyond. See, we have God, and that's intangible. It's far away. Death is very far. It's clean. It's sanitized. You know, we embalm the dead and we make them not even look like they're dead, and we try and sanitize
Mm-hmm.
our death all the time. Whereas it's completely embraced within uh, Japanese culture, and it shows through their art forms. There is a kuzutsu, which is what they used to do was have artists paint bodies which would just be left to rot rather than dug into graves like what we do, suppressing the death. What happens is they left the bodies to rot, and artists would paint those, and these images painted onto hand scrolls were part of the contemplation of impermanence.
Right, and that's very similar to their sort of parallel within objective art, the concept of wabi sabi,
Yeah.
where you're embracing imperfection, embracing how things
Mm.
change, and there's beauty in that change. The idea of putting something on a pedestal and making it a permanent wax figure of a never changing thing is very, very foreign to that sort of Eastern philosophy, Japanese, Chinese, all of them, where they have this embrace of things change, things break, and there's something precious in the emergent properties of a broken
Yeah,
or
yeah.
changed thing.
But however, you were talking about wax. Um, in Florence, Clement Susini's wax models were posed with their insides exposed for anatomists in sort of early 19th century. This was kind of like an art which was crafted specifically for knowledge, but and there was a beauty within Venerina, I think they called her. Um, but the beauty was kind of like a mask of the inevitable, which again, as it's from Florence, European Western type embracing of death doesn't really go that far, and so she's more in the throes of ecstasy and not decay. So we're sort of sensoriously detached from the rot of her body, which we're definitely not with Kazutsu. We're not detached from the pagan sort of animism of the Japanese culture, which is reflected within the
Mm.
art.
Do you find that is another one of those? I mean, you spoke about aesthetic
Mm.
philosophy parallels. Do you find that's another parallel within Goth, or is it so I guess culturally specific. I mean, you brought up cultural appropriation earlier. Do you feel like that becomes problematic if you want to say, well, Goths have this sort of affiliation and understanding of death, and so do the Japanese, and so does
Yeah.
Hispanic culture, let's say. So there are, they therefore share some cultural similarities, or is that too reaching?
I think what it does is just helps my argument towards the end, because I put together
Mhm.
this embracing of death. Um, in the embracing of death, and in wearing that kind of, and becoming the ghost, which I think the geisha does also, but I'll explain that later maybe. In becoming the ghost and wearing that ghost as a semiotic expression.
Well, we can sort of stick on the notion of the Gothic for just a moment before we move on to something else. Because I did actually want to ask you about that, since there are plenty of, and I've talked with a few friends of mine who are academics, and they all have different opinions on the way that, whether it's through these Gothic academic conferences, or there's plenty of examples of academics, sociologists, anthropologists using the Gothic as a framework to interpret the sort of modern goth milieu. Like, more salient examples that I could think of were Spooner's post-millennial
Mm,
Gothic, where she uses it as a way to understand goth lifestyle curation, and then there was Van Elfren's Sounds of the Uncanny, where she tries to use it as a way to understand goth music. So it's sort of now, I have some of my own thoughts I want to share to see how you feel about it. But you're speaking of the Gothic as death, and the sort of kind of embodied spectral liminality. I think that's something Van Alphen talks about, that you were also sort of talking about as well, and the way that fits within Gothic literature. Do you find that um, is it a deep connection, or is it a framework through which we can understand modern Goth
I
culture?
think it's a small part of it. Um,
Hmm.
I don't think you can explain the entirety of goth subculture with Gothic literature. It's just a vein that runs through it. Just, I mean, let's start with The Damned's Plan 9 Channel 7 provides a loving tribute to Vampira, obviously coming from,
Mm.
you know, Gothic media, I would say, not literature.
Yeah.
Um, then there's The Beauty of the Beast, which was obviously Dave Banian's love affair with films that came from Gothic literature, that stemmed from it.
That would also maybe be a reference to the traditional, the sort of Byronic archetype, the monster as
Mm.
man.
Yeah. In an interview for I think fashionsalternative.com, Vanian states his sophisticated look was actually based on early cinema, esoteric art, and lashings of Gothic fiction. So he admits, that Gothic fiction was an inspiration for him, and he's one of the earliest. 76, he was walking around, in a haze of disbeauty. He was brazenly elegant and singular in his darkly sartorially inclined tastes. Darkly inclined sartorial taste. There we go. How's that? Then you've got, UK Decay, early sort of gothic band. They sort of had a dark lyrical content which was based on Gothic literature. The obvious examples are a Black Cat, based on Edgar Allan Poe's short story,
Mm.
Dorian, based on Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, and Werewolf, clearly invoking the amazing Gothic beast that is. And the frontman Abel, as you know, all of this probably, he had an interview for Sounds in 1981, and he turned punk gothic.
Mm.
He obviously was then acknowledging his influence in Gothic literature, and also the Trees, which you may know of, an early goth band whom I love,
Mm.
with a dark romantic visual, of course, which they took from, it was sort of Byronic as you were mentioning Byron, so there we go. Link up. Most iconic, obviously, is Lugosi's dead. That's obvious. I tried to actually get in contact with David J to to talk
Oh,
to him about the lyrics, but he didn't get back to me. He's on tour, isn't he?
at the moment he is, yeah.
Of course, and also the Trees said in an interview that they were the only true Gothic band. So
Did they? I
yeah,
missed that one.
referring to themselves as Gothic again, taken in the literature. So
Right.
it's a vein, I mean, but it's not how you can explain the entirety of goth culture. I don't think you can do that. It's a very strange angle to take.
That's I'm glad that you say that. I agree with you. I thought about this a little bit, and this is sort of a recurring topic on the show, but there are I usually disparage that sort of notion of understanding goth through the gothic, but there are obvious similarities that I feel I could at least point out. Um,
Mm,
One of them is from my perspective, the sort of sartorial excess in goth performativity that's shared with the gothic and gothic literature. There's obviously thematic similarities in some of the lyrical content and the atmosphere presented by the music. Um, there was, Elfrind points this out. I'm rereading her book. This hauntological these hauntological elements in the rituals of goth that serve to unmoor the goth body from time and place, which is most saliently presented with the goth club. And I think there's some you can make some philosophical similarities if we look at the ontology or identity of a lot of goths in the way that they embody those identifiable gothic tropes.
mm,
um, so I think there is a lot of understandably reason to, especially if your background is in gothic literature, to want to make the argument for understanding goth through that framework. But I agree with you. I think that I think it's pretty obvious that the community was engendered or but came about through the music and art movements of the 80s. You only get part of the picture if you try to interpret it through a gothic uh framework, but I don't think it's without merit to look through that lens to try and understand the identities and the milieu around
mm.
goth identities.
So that's essentially what I'm doing, just focusing in rather than. I mean, I would be writing forever
Right.
if I was
Right.
including
Yeah,
everything.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's fair. So oh, Trey is sending me. Oh, that's what's the message. Okay. Uh
Oh yeah, I sent
oh,
that a while
okay.
ago. It was just it was a link to some pictures of that wax figure that
Oh
Genevieve was
my. Yeah,
mentioning.
look at that.
Just to
Yeah,
give
she's in
you
the throes of
just to give you
ecstasy, isn't
a
she?
visual.
Wow, that is incredible. Huh.
But there's so much beauty there that you can't really relate to any kind of tangible death.
Right.
It's kind of
Hmm.
what's the word? Sublime.
Hmm. Okay, so let's move on from that a bit then. I don't know, where do you want to go next? What's the next step in your research?
Basically, what I do is I start off with a little bit of geisha history,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
um,
Please share that.
and some harmless etymology, of course. So the look that we know now, the geisha that we see on every kind of image, the geisha that's appropriated everywhere, is something that developed fully in the 18th century. But before this, geisha were under various guises and they've been evolving for centuries. But they have their roots in 7th century Saburuku. I could be pronouncing that wrong. In all likelihood, I am. But these were Japanese women who, in desperate economic times, yielded to the trade of sexual favors for survival. Some of the women utilized their talent and education to earn higher pay at upper class parties. In the 12th to the 14th century, shirabayoshi, or daughters of the rich, were actually called upon to perform at parties to make ends meet for their families, also in struggling economic times. But they're very highly educated women. They were valued for musical abilities, dancing, poetical talents, their artistry, basically. In the 1730s, the geisha emerged actually as a distinct class within Yoshiwara's licensed pleasure district, which had many high-class prostitutes called oiran. Could be pronouncing that wrong also. As the brothel customers actually awaited the chosen courtesan, very high-class courtesans, actually completely legal, set up by the Japanese government, which I think was wonderful at the time when we were still the Western suppression
Right.
comes in again. But anyway, so completely licensed pleasure district in Yoshiwara. So they would have brothel customers waiting for their courtesans. What they were was artfully distracted by dance, song, amusing conversation, and that was initially by male geisha. And this is how the geisha, which we know now, actually branched away from sort of the trade of prostitution. What they branched into was the trade of art. So originally they were male geisha, but female geisha were employed in the same role, and they proved much popular with the brothel attendees. So the unisex term actually began to split, and the male geisha gradually became known as otoko geisha, or hokan, or taiko mochi. They still exist today, actually. And female geisha became gaiko, which is a term used still to refer to the geisha from Kyoto.
You said otaku?
Yeah.
Was
Wait,
that okay?
otoko.
Okay.
Otoko.
Okay.
Oscar,
I was going to say
Tango,
different
Oscar.
word. Close.
I've heard that used in anime circles, but I wasn't sure if that was the same. If that was the origin of the term. Okay.
No, they're
very
very different. Otaku is basically geek. So it's sort of
The
those
geek
who are
geisha,
obsessed with
nice.
things, where otaku is a different
right.
thing.
Okay.
They kept the term gaiko for geisha, which were from Tokyo. Otherwise, around the country, they were known as geisha, and the trainee geisha were called maiko. That translates into dancing girl, literally. So in order to avoid confusion between the professional performers, which were the geisha, and the very similarly adorned high-class courtesans, the geisha were actually strictly limited on when they could work and what they could wear, and they were forbidden from owning a prostitution license, and they were restricted to a more subdued appearance. So a notable way to actually discern the difference between a high-class courtesan and a geisha would be the obi sash that they wear. Basically, everything they wear has some kind of meaning. I mean, even the patterns in their kimono denote the meanings of, the time of year, and even the things they wear in their hair. I mean, the way they hold their kimono is very different to high-class geisha, and the way they wear their obi belt is primarily the way that you would tell them apart. So the courtesan wore the obi tied to the front so she could remove it for her work, but the geisha would have the obi tied firmly at the back by an aide, so they wouldn't be able to remove it themselves. Because this is, it's what defined them as artists. They kept having to define it over and over again, so they didn't take the business away from the courtesans. So as sexual favors were not the geisha's trade, they actually thrived under the confines that were given to them. They adopted a less elaborate aesthetic. They became more refined, and it was thought to be quite chic. They became something of a style icon, and the modest appearance is actually still worn by fully trained geisha today. So the more made-up version that we see and that we're familiar with is from maiko, so that's the trainee geisha. So they've got the ghostly makeup, the ornate kimono, the ornamented hairstyle. That's the iconic vision that we see globally. So to the geisha, her art is life, and life is an art form to be cultivated, usually through rigorous discipline and training and dedication to their craft. So, I mean, it literally means performing arts and performing person, artist. Geisha literally means artist. I could explain that better. So geisha comes from gei, meaning performing arts, and sha, meaning person. So yeah, it literally means artist.
Right.
So they hung around with kabuki actors and basically in the floating world. It was actually a place where people who were visiting could cast aside their weighted concerns and actually assume a constitution that's lighter than air. Literally. So
Right.
it was sort of like a bohemian treasury, which we would normally associate with the decadent culture of Paris, but in the theater quarters of Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka, geisha and kabuki artists were actually doing this sort of bohemian world way before that.
That's interesting.
So the word ukiyo is actually a homophone. It's a Buddhist term meaning sorrowful world. So that's a nice little poetic adage.
Yeah.
Sort of signifying the torment in an ephemeral life. So yeah, they are what they did was just provide some sort of medicine for this sort of existential sorrow provided by Buddhism.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
So like a balm with fleeting pleasures. So that's what made the geisha not a prostitute and an actual artist trading in art, which was a wonderful thing to actually do at the time, especially during war, which is it's really controversial because you have your I mean when the Emperor Meiji opened his borders, I'm saying that really Scottish, aren't I? Borders. When he opened those to the West, I mean, they were already open to Dutch traders, of course, and China. But when they opened to the West, when trade was going back and forth, there was obviously Japonisma, could be saying that wrong, that came into fashion. There was this sort of exoticism of the East. And you had your Madame Chrysanthème, which really falsely showed what a geisha was like. This turned her into this precious little flower to be bought, which was not the geisha's trade in the slightest. What they were doing was confusing the geisha with courtesans. So we have this, we generally, the West, or just us three, we have this false impression of the geisha as this sort of prostitute and this sort of wilting flower, which they definitely were not. They were really robust, bold.
Well, to touch on that same thing with the misunderstanding of the West, my understanding to some degree was that there was definitely a part of that that stemmed from that sort of spur in the concept of Orientalism in the West that was really big in the 50s through 70s, especially around Vietnam and the GIs that were over in the East. Around that, they would go out there and they'd have this idea of the geisha, and then there would be actual courtesans who would cater to that myth, because the geisha, the true geisha, would be they weren't accessible in the way that the Westerners wanted the women to be. So there would be actual prostitutes who would make themselves up as geisha to cater to that market, and then we took that memory of, oh, this is what geisha are, back to the US, which is where a lot of them got, or where we got on the United States side, the idea that geishas are just sort of fancy prostitutes, due to this, just, the market trying to cater to
Yeah,
a
they
myth.
called themselves Geisha girls, which is why you got the wrong pronunciation as well. Not you specifically, just
Yeah,
you generally,
sure.
Americans. You terrible lot.
Uh-huh.
I would agree.
Oh, but we specialize in mispronunciation. That's our bread
Oh,
and
I do
butter.
too. I
Me
do too.
specifically.
I've been doing it all evening. But yeah, the Geisha girls. That was I think it was during the war. They were very poor women who were trying to make their money off of Western men and their sort of romanticization that they got from these books, especially from Madame Chrysanthème, which led into, of course, Madame Butterfly and then Madama Butterfly, the book. Puccini's opera, Madama Butterfly. I think it was like 1904 or something. But then,
Yes, around there.
so they had this idea of the demure, quiet, servile wife type, which was already a familiar Japanese concept. They were called Yamato Nadeshiko, which was your sort of wilting flower. But what Japanese men, it was mainly men who ordered geisha services. What they would do is go to the geisha because that she could be brazen, bold, unabashed, drink sake with him, and not be his wife. They were trained in the art of wit and conversation, and they were completely the opposite of this idea, which was an Orientalist fantasy, which is actually turned around by Gothic fiction in Angela Carter's. I think it was called. Where is it? Poor Butterfly.
That's perhaps
Okay.
another link between the idea of Gothic literature and this concept where, in the era that Gothic literature was popular, the concept of men and women, the woman being the demure housekeeper type, taking
Mm.
care of the kids and all of that, is not terribly dissimilar to the ideal of the Japanese wife, whereas the heroines in Gothic literature were usually the wild women who weren't able to be contained and were out there interacting with men in the same playing field. And that does feel like there's a degree of similarity there.
Yeah, especially in Anne Radcliffe. I mean, she definitely defined that strong woman who
Mm-hmm.
is
Yeah.
almost like a Scooby Doo kind of Thelma character trying to work out what's going on. This isn't really a ghost.
Right.
It's that dude down the road.
Right.
It's that kind of thing she was doing. But yeah, in Gothic literature they do have sometimes they do have that wilting woman, especially in The Grey Woman by Elizabeth Gaskell. But won't mention that. That would take too long. I would say Wuthering Heights is an obvious one.
Mhm.
The real
Yes.
demon is obviously Heathcliff. It's not the ghost of Kathy. It's not the demon. It's not the ghost. That's not the thing you should be frightened of. She was the one who was the victim in the situation.
Right.
And in I think the Wild Woman, more so in Japanese folklore and Japanese Gothic fiction, is almost like a fear of this sort of patriarchal society that Japan still
Mm-hmm.
has.
Yeah.
That fear is put into their Gothic literature and their Japanese folklore, almost like the equivalent of our medieval history that was drawn from to create Gothic literature. So yeah, they drew from the Japanese folklore, which has yurei, which are essentially just mad women who have just transported into this world of the dead, which is all around them, and because they're in this liminal world, it makes them all the much more frightening. So yeah, in the geisha, in becoming that ghost, the geisha has literally become a ghost actually in Gothic literature and games and various things. Where's the geisha a ghost? I would say there is sculpture. See, now I'm reading stuff. There are sculptures by. Name me a famous sculptor.
Rodin. Michelangelo.
And it bloody well is. It's Rodin.
Oh, there we go.
Wow.
You genius. You genius. Let's do this telepathically from now on. So yeah, he had these ghostly images which he created. These sort of busts and masks. He created nearly 60 of them, so they were quite striking when put together. There were sort of death scenes and expressions while Madame Hanako was acting. She was an ex-geisha. I think this is the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th. But while she was acting, he took her expressions and made a ghost out of her with these busts. They're just beautiful. There is that. There's also, of course, Angela Carter, when the geisha becomes a literal ghost. And there is this wonderful story. I can't remember the author, but it's called The Tattooer. It's a Japanese short story. I think it's published beginning of the 20th century, very beginning. It could be likened to Frankenstein's creature creation story because there's a tattooist. He attempts to find a perfect female to present his art, his tattooing. He finds a beautiful young geisha. He drugs her, tattoos a magnificent spider on her back, which may actually be influenced, maybe an influence from the Jorogumu, which is called the horror spider. It's another yurei, another example of male patriarchy and their fear. So he tattoos this beautiful spider. So he's creating his monster, and eventually she awakens, and with her sort of awakens like the spirit of the spider and the revealing of her true self and the frightening seductive power of her womanhood. And with, as it says in the book, with a glance as bright as a sword, she destroys her maker, just like the aforementioned. But it's beautiful, and of course the geisha is the ghost in the picture. And the most famous example that you probably know of a ghost is called the ghost of Oyuki. It's where we get that sort of white burial kimono, long black hair, the grudge, the ring,
Right.
all that stuff, all comes from the ghost of Oyuki, which was mid 18th century rendering of a young geisha. The artist was actually her lover. She appeared to him apparently, and as an apparition, and of course his sorrow and his bereavement just poured onto a scroll, and he created the first ever rendering of a yurei, or a female ghost. And that image is of a geisha, and that sort of cements the geisha with the ghost in Japanese imagination, and obviously all over the world now, because that's how we see Japanese ghosts, with their burial kimonos.
So to go back to that book, it looks like the author was Junichiro Tanizaki.
I'm just going to say yeah.
I'm looking at the
tell me,
Amazon page now. It's got a spider on the cover. I'm pretty sure it's the tattooer.
Yeah, it's a lovely story. And you should look up the Jorogumu as well. She's a beautiful horse spider, so she is. So the otherworldliness, basically the otherworldliness of the geisha seems ripe for literature and media portrayals. And what the geisha is doing is she's subverting her supposed role as this demure, wilting flower, and becoming somebody who trades in art, which is completely against the patriarchal norm of Japanese culture. I mean, she lives in a house run by women. It's entirely run by women. The business for women. It's not. It's quite feminist in nature, actually. If you think about it.
Yeah. So then this, obviously this relates to Gothic literature that we're more familiar with in the West. But there's also, I don't know if getting into aesthetics was the next step here, but obviously there are uses of that aesthetic in goth, sort of historically.
Yeah, the
Susie Sue being the most salient, but I don't know if you can speak to that a bit.
the makeup is obviously very prominent.
Mm,
How else can I put that?
mm,
Geisha was an artist of the ukiyo, the floating world, and obviously she was influenced by kabuki actors, onagata, and sometimes just enamored with them romantically. They were always linked up, even though geisha weren't allowed to be romantically inclined, but there we go. So being enamored by kabuki artists, kind of wearing makeup for the same kind of reasons as a kabuki artist to highlight their face in dimly lit theaters.
So there's
I,
apparently a boss fight in the game Neo with a Jorogumo.
That sounds
I
cool.
don't know that game.
Actually, when I was doing that model of the year thing, alternative model of the year thing, um, people actually said I looked like a boss. Someone at the end of the level, you're just like,
It's
I'll
NIOH if
take
you're looking
that,
it up, Daniel.
and I will run away with that.
Yeah, it sounds familiar, or maybe it's being used in the new. Oh no, I do know, and I do know this game because it's like a Dark Souls similar
Yes.
game. Yeah.
Yes.
Along that vein, wasn't there something? Little Monsters had Geisha as a Little Nightmares. Sorry, horror adventure game.
Mm.
Main villain is a geisha. In Matsu, they have these ghost walks, and what they do is they point out the deaths of geishas.
Oh wow.
And they tell the stories like she was being bothered by a samurai and she refused his advances, tried to get away. I struck her with his sword. She died in a pool of blood, all that kind of stuff. So the geisha as a ghost is definitely something within the imagination of Japan.
Mm.
But yeah,
Interesting.
I'll go into the makeup. Yeah, the distinctive white face worn by kabuki actors dates back to the Heian era, where it was worn by courtesans to reflect the candlelight on their delicate features during their dark exchanges. So the resurgence of the makeup in kabuki theater was partially due to a romanticized view of the Heian or Golden Age, and for the same reason, which was to reflect the light of the actors' expressions. Geisha of the ukiyo were also enamored with the onagata, sometimes romantically, and were also inspired to adopt the ghostly aspect for their performances for obviously the same reasons, because they were under candlelight and they needed their expressions to be highlighted for their art form. The white rice powder is called oshiroi. Could be pronouncing that wrong. It was accompanied by colors which actually represented different character qualities in kabuki theater. So red was representative of anger, passion, or cruelty. Black represented fear. And the supernatural heroes and the villains that were portrayed were drawn from Japanese folklore. So the folklore, with its history of yori, there's a link up there.
Mm.
Of the yuri being the ghosts, the ghostly pallor, the ghostly aspect, adopted by the geisha. Moving on, obviously, you have David Bowie,
Mm.
who was an influence on,
Everybody.
yeah,
On the little, I guess, paragraph knowledge dump that Daniel gave me that I guess you sent him quite a while ago, I think you mentioned David Bowie in relationship with Susie.
yeah, I do. Yeah, that's all knowledge that comes from, well, obviously, being a goth, but my partner is one of them. Their original
Okay.
Batcave types,
Mm-hmm.
still in the packaging. Haven't taken him out. But he has all knowledge of this sort of this cultural contortion from punk to goth.
Okay.
He had a early new wave band, actually post-punk band. You would call it, called Fractured Nerve. Weren't very famous at all. Locally
Hmm.
famous, but other than
Sure,
that,
sure.
not really. But yeah, he has all of that knowledge. He actually said something really interesting to me the other day, and I thought, oh, that would be weird if that was the theory. He said that the types of garments that people used to wear that came from sort of historical reenactments and stuff like that. There was a big sale in about 79. There was a big sale in this warehouse of historical period clothing. And
Hmm.
essentially, he says that's what created your new romantics. It just came from all of that cheap clothing. So that's an interesting theory if that's really true.
It is interesting, yeah.
I only heard half of what you just said, but it reminded me of there was a recent interview somebody did with Ronan of VNV Nation. Weirdly enough, actually, it was postpunk.com, and he brought up, I think he brought up the Smiths, or it was the Cramps maybe, and he said he was speaking with back in the 80s with a fan of the band who was wearing the same clothes as them, and he asked the guy why, and he said, "Oh, because it's the fashion. It's what, people are wearing. It's pretty cool." And Ronan went on to explain that the what he didn't understand was they wore those clothes out of necessity because it's what they could buy at the secondhand stores,
Yeah,
and it wasn't a show thing. They wore that for the show. They wore it home. They wore it to bed. They wore it the next day, but because they were sort of the cultural, music icons, that's, naturally was mimicked and modified by the fans.
yeah. And my partner says that it's mainly sort of Adamant fans that
Mm,
adopted that sort of look first of all, early
Oh yeah.
ants.
Yeah, he was, I think, one of the first people who were doing that whole new romantic, neoclassical, pseudo
Mm.
pirate fashion.
yeah.
Yeah, I should speak to Barbarossa about that. I haven't talked to him in a long time. I really need to talk to him about Burundi beats with something I was going to write coming up. Um, as I read something about goth being based in Africa, modern goth culture, and I was like, okay, here's another
Hmm.
vein. It's interesting. I might
Hmm.
follow it and see where that goes. And of course, you've got what's his name, Screaming Jay Hawkins, and you've
Yeah.
got
Hmm.
those Burundi beats, and obviously the integration of black culture in that cultural contortion, late 70s, early 80s. Um, it's an interesting angle to take, but I mean, I don't know how far that would go.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of African influence in early post punk or the evolution of post punk. Though most of it was more Afro Caribbean, but then that does come directly out of Africa to some degree
Mm.
as well. But there was a lot of that
And of
in the
course,
rhythmic
dub,
structures. Right. Well,
dub,
Yeah.
dub,
that
Yeah.
dub.
was where it really came in. Is that was the sort of core Afro Caribbean dub sound that got everybody excited about these fascinating bass lines and interesting rhythms.
Mm.
Yeah, I do know. I'm a little familiar with some of the '80s black punk bands, like Death and Bad Brains are the two I can think of. But I that does actually make me, bring me around to, and I don't know if this was part of your research or what you were writing about, but taking in all of that history and the relation with Gothic literature and this spectrality and embodiment of um, the subversion and of death and the liminality and that kind of thing. Does that uh, does that bring you into the modern day then, and sort of examples of where either this has been incorporated into goth culture, or is it or get do you not go there? Is it more of a historical analysis?
Um, it is more historical at the moment. I think if I was to
Okay.
research it further, I would definitely include modern interpretations, maybe of painful art within Gothic culture.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I would have to look at that further. I think I
Okay.
stop in the 80s. I
Okay.
don't really actually.
Fair
I, I
enough.
I do talk about Madonna's wonderful Gothic look. I mean, she is Madonna.
Mm.
We can all ignore that. Um, but she has that wonderful Gothic look in her video. Nothing really matters, is it? No, maybe it's not that one. Yeah, it's Nothing Really Matters. That music video, 1998, and of course Björk and her lovely album cover.
Yeah, I'd say Bjork is definitely embraced within not an insignificant subset of the Gothic culture. Not necessarily as an influencer or a touchstone, but as an aesthetic
Mm.
Yeah. I've
thing that's enjoyed.
I've heard of. I haven't experienced. I've heard of Bjork being played at goth clubs as well. Even so, there's certainly some influence there.
That's
Yeah,
interesting. Hmm. I wouldn't
Well,
have
let
thought so, but there we go. Did I was
yeah.
at
No, neither.
I was on Bowie, wasn't I?
Yeah.
Hmm.
right.
Mm.
You're talking about Bowie and
Yes.
his influence and how he took Orientalism, his ideas that Orientalism is Japanophilia,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
brought it
yeah.
into other artists and influenced other artists.
Um, yeah. So as he's the great progenitor of punk, new wave, goth, any other musical and subcultural movement since forever, um, he was a well-known Japanophile, and he was a student of Lindsay Kemp, and Lindsay Kemp performed kabuki theater, performance art. Um, David Bowie didn't just appropriate the style though, because he got in famous Onagata to teach him how to do the makeup properly. And what he did was he
Hmm.
took influence. He didn't copy directly. He took influence and applied. He's the great magpie, isn't he? He just takes from everywhere and
Yeah.
makes it his own. But yeah, he was taught by famous Onagata how to apply kabuki makeup, and that became his his look as Ziggy. Um, he also roped in, probably didn't, he probably spoke to him really nicely, um, fashion designer Kanzai Yamamoto, and he was behind most of his dramatic stage outfits. You know, he has those wonderful Japanese silks and the huge, um, sort of, it was more like a cloak, and then the huge legs. I'm sure everybody knows what I'm on about.
Mhm.
You can
I know the
imagine it in
picture
your
with the
brain.
big legs. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was sort of traditional Japanese garments. Well, inspiration was drawn from traditional Japanese garments, traditional kimono and samurai trousers and so on. Um, so we had that shortened kimono. I think that's the Japanese silk I'm talking about with the Japanese print, which is iconic now and obviously was very, very influential at the time. And there are countless quotes from people who became famous during the punk explosion, um, into post-punk and goth, and just how influential Bowie was, both visually, culturally, and Susie Sue was one of those. Um, she actually had this an interview with Bowie biographer Dylan Jones. She venerates Bowie, and she said she wanted that otherworldly look, but she, like Bowie with the Onagata, um, Susie didn't copy directly. She took it and she made it her own.
Mm.
And I think she may have spliced it with this sort of screen vamp look, which I could talk about later if you'd like, because there's a lovely vein, um, which also, I mean, that kind of makeup look, the screen vamp, you know, Elvira, Vampira,
Right. Yeah.
comes from Theda Bara.
Yes.
Initially, the vamp look, I mean, she was obviously the original screen vamp,
Yeah.
but she had to apply. I mean, there's a tradition in Europe, especially Britain, in theatres which were very dimly lit, to apply very thick makeup, which is the dark eyes, the very pale skin, to make their expressions stand out. Moving on from that, it was sort of like sloppily applied thick makeup because they weren't very visually You couldn't see the actors very very well. So no matter how much makeup they had on, you couldn't see how unrefined it was until there was gaslight in the sort of early 19th century, and that picked up many obvious flaws in their sloppily applied makeup. So the actors actually became more adept at applying their own grease paint and powders, and that was marketed and became Max Factor and all that wonderful stuff. But in silent cinema, they kind of had to go back to scratch with the orthochromatic and blue sensitive film. The actors actually had to apply much heavier and more dramatic makeup again, but in sort of different color tones. So they had to normalize their appearance on the screen. It was kind of a time of experimentation, so there was many flaws. But somebody who did get it right was obviously Theda Bara, and she sort of cultivated this trademark look with the lily white powder on her skin and the smoky kohl around her eyes. It fell out of fashion in the late 20s with the adoption of panchromatic film, but basically the idea of the screen vamp and the striking image which Theda Bara created was cemented together with successive screen vamps. So as I said, like Morticia Adams, Malia Nurmi's Vampira, and Elvira, and so on. And then you can go, if that's a link you want to take, you can go to The Damned, you can go to Dave Vanian, who's obviously inspired. If you look at the video for Plan 9 Channel 7, he's obviously inspired by this look as well. And his makeup was the same, it was implied in the same way as Theda Bara, the very dark kohl around the eyes. So I think he takes that vein into Gothic culture. But going back to Susie, she takes the vein from Kabuki and from the geisha as performing artists. And obviously everybody wants to look like Susie, so that's what took that into Gothic culture. And I think as I look at Gothic geishas and images of them online, you can see that they've done their research, that they actually care about the aesthetic, they care about the history, the finely crafted sort of kimonos, and they've taken inspiration from the source and perhaps not copied it directly. It's very sympathetically done most of the time. But not all of the time.
Right.
But yeah, that's that ghostly pallor, that pale aspect, the countenance. It in Gothic culture comes from those two veins.
It would be interesting, I think, to explore that, and whether that translates into modern goth culture, because I think a lot of there's been discussion around the notion of whiteness being the sort of epitome of the most goth, and sort of that relating back to a British sort of white centric identity, and how that has become a problem for modern day goths.
Yeah, I do understand that. But basically, I think what I'm trying to do is explain where it may have come from, where the influence may have come from. If I was to get into an argument about that, I would write a different paper.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do understand that is I think it's a thing that's fading definitely within Gothic culture because we're all growing up, basically.
Yeah, one would like to think, at least. Maybe perhaps not as central to what you were focusing on in your research, but just out of curiosity, I wanted to get your take on the sort of, I guess, global Gothic thing, and this idea of, well, Paul Hodgkinson has this notion of shared distinctiveness when looking at goth communities across cultures. And so from your perspective, and it could be from a UK perspective, do you find that there's more um um homogeneity or heterogeneity, and what are the some of the ways that some of the cultural differences, I guess, that you see between Goths, or is it sort of that shared um distinctiveness?
I think you could say that modern Goth culture in Japan looks to be very appropriated. It's almost a romanticization of Goth. Um,
Mm,
but there was, I mean, they definitely had that cultural wave from punk to Gothic in Japan from the late 70s, early 80s. They had listeners in Japan called yogaku. Um, and with the echoing vocals, tribal drum beats, early Gothic rock sound, um, that was all imported and adapted into Japanese groups like Automod and Madame Eduarda. Tokyo did have a positive punk scene, i.e., Gothic. It's called Pojipan, which I think is a
mm.
wonderful name. So that was formed, and then it moved on to things like I'm not quite sure how to say it, Fida. I've never said that out loud.
Yeah,
I've
I'm not
always
sure.
I've
Yeah.
always read it. um, so they did have a similar scene, but I think the aesthetic is very overblown, very romanticized. It is
Mm,
obviously based on the, I would say, London-centric scene, but it's not.
right.
They don't wear the
Yeah.
same kind of the symbolism, the crucifixes. They don't have the same semiotic meanings.
Right.
There's no expression of that, so it doesn't have the same resonance. And there's very different religious backgrounds, but the aesthetics there. Is their
Yeah.
shared lifestyle? Probably, from what I've heard and from what I've read, it seems. Um, I think we would call them weekend goths, people who just dress up for the weekend. It
Right.
seems to be the culture in Japan. I think I'm generalizing greatly, but
There is a lot of that in some of the youth culture up there, especially in some of the
That's what I was gonna
the
ask,
the
yeah.
the hipper districts of Japan where they have um not I mean they oftentimes are termed tribes. They're not like neo tribes, but it's groups of people that have a very specific aesthetic, and they all dress together in that aesthetic. And some of the visual kei groups have that as in their fandom, as well as there are ones that aesthetically are drawn to the gothic looks from the west. There's also the gothic Lolita, which of course is both on the west and the east.
mm,
But I think that did stem in the east primarily. But there is a lot of that in Japanese culture where they take Western cultural ideas and just they reflect them through a very interesting Eastern cultural perspective,
Yeah.
and they definitely use it, but it's oftentimes very much an aesthetic rather than a whole culture. It's much more visually based from everything I've seen about it.
yeah, I would agree, definitely.
Yeah, it seems to be my perception from the outside. I mean, I'm familiar with a couple of the bands you named. Also, the one I'm am most aware of is 13th Moon, which also has that
Mm.
sort of cinema strange, like death rock
Oh,
aesthetic.
I love Cinema Strange.
Um, yeah,
There's also Spookjack. They're okay, and they have a very good aesthetic. But I mean, it is all it's very surface.
right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the big
And
famous
most,
aesthetic band is going to be Malice Miser.
Sure.
mm,
Yeah, that's yeah, getting more into metal. There's a lot of that.
but most
And
of
yeah,
what you'll find is actually the music is heavy metal, seems to be, and the look is goth.
Right. Yeah. I think that's about. I think that's a fairly robust discussion around the sort of crossover of these two seemingly very different, you know, uh, cultural perceptions, especially in modernity.
Hmm.
Probably the main thing that I was thinking of when I first read about this research, or was reading the little excerpt you sent me uh, from the
Mm,
paper, is the place of, I guess, individuality within the scenes, comparing the geisha individuality, which is very much steeped in tradition, and having a very unified aesthetic, and every aspect of their outfits have this very specific meaning, and the sort of more free form, almost anti-traditional aesthetic coming out of the goth, um, just look, and the idea that it's just you're expressing yourself in a very unique way rather than using traditional touchstones to project a message or an identity. So any thoughts on that, or just the place of traditionalism within the two cultures?
Do you mean coming from religious backgrounds or philosophical backgrounds?
No, less religious and philosophical, but more just, well, I guess it is sort of philosophical, but the idea, within the geisha culture, the very weighty idea of the meanings of specific, as you were mentioning, patterns in the kimonos, the way the obi is done, the meanings of specific colors and makeup styles and hairstyles, and how all of that has a meaning that's been passed on traditionally through the
Mm.
history of geisha culture, in contrast to the, I guess, sort of
Mm.
ideal of goth, where every individual is doing their own thing and expressing their own unique individuality, through a look, rather than necessarily leaning on a traditional foundation.
Yeah, I would agree that the goth look is more individual, whereas the geisha is more of a brushstroke within a larger work of art, a larger painting. And I think that does come from a philosophical background. We'll go into philosophy here. I'll cover Nishida, who's a famous Japanese philosopher.
Hmm.
mm,
And he posed. Yeah, so basically, Nishida has a different subject object dichotomy um,
mm.
in the
Oh, wait,
first
please tell me
place.
about that.
So,
I'd love to hear about that.
he was basically interested in the pure consciousness that exists prior to differentiating the subject from the object. So, he would transcend the concrete self or the ego, and what that allows us to do is to reflect upon our place in the world. And he called that basho. Um, so um, that helps us recognize our human finitude,
Mm,
as or you could come back to the contemplation of impermanence there, the Buddhist philosophy. It's the
right.
same kind of thing. So he's basically posing that without ego, we don't really own our own human finitude. So why would you fear it? And that would be his answer to the question of painful art. Why would we fear death if we are not the subject? I mean, death is a meditation as absolute negation. And um, if meditation is absolute negation, then meditation is absolute death. Or in other words, death
Mm,
is not a fearful event at the end of your life. Rather, it penetrates life at each and every moment without really revealing its aspect to us. So, vicariously living out mortality through art can help us glimpse the face of death. And that provides us with comfort or a reason of terror, depends on your philosophical makeup. Um, but what Nishida did was he urged assimilation between Western philosophy and the traditions of Far East thought. So I think he's the perfect answer to go into understanding why the geisha may not see themselves, may not have an ego, as much as we're taught to have one in, quote, the West, within our culture. That we have the subject object,
Right.
which he just overrides.
Right. No,
Basically.
I love that. Yeah, I like that a lot. Especially the idea of meditation as negation or sort of unbecoming and relating that to death as well. I like
Yeah.
that a lot. I do tend to reject the notion of the observer observed dichotomy. And I mean, I'm more on the sort of ontological and activism side of the idea that together we are all through some interaction that perhaps goes all the way to the bottom are bringing forth through sort of embodiment our own shared reality, and that like observing something isn't a passive act where you just sort of open your eyes and the world floods in, but it is a on every levels, every sort of organismal level is an interaction, um, which kind of I think relates to that in a way of getting past the sort of I don't know, anthropomorphic focus on human human interaction or humans as the only thing that matters in sort of the larger ecosystem of the world.
I mean,
Uh,
anthropocentric.
anthropocentric, is that not what I said? Yeah,
You said
anthropocentric.
pomorphic.
That's what I meant. Anthropocentric. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, there's definitely Nishida that what you just described him.
mm,
Well, his philosophy of nothingness, which sounds
yeah.
a tinge of nihilism, but it's not. It's
Well, it's not a despair.
Mm,
Nihilism is
yeah.
sort
yeah.
of you look into the abyss and you despair, where this idea is more you look into the abyss and you find release. You're no
Hmm.
longer struggling against something. You're no longer struggling to hold on to things. It's all just grains of sand drifting through your fingertips, and it doesn't matter.
Sure. I think from a ethical perspective as well, or I guess at least from a sort of atheistic view, if there is, simply the abyss after death, then it makes, at least from the way I view things, it makes what we have now more important than if you can sort of say, well, there's always an afterlife or there's always something after, where if you look at like some impoverished child somewhere, it makes the imperative to help them even more uh, important, because this is the pinnacle of what it means to experience the world and to be alive and to make this what we have right now as meaningful and beneficial for everyone's sort of uh, uh, ontological enactment or becoming. It makes that even more important, I think, at least from my view.
Yeah, I like that.
And that was pretty much the only thing
Yeah.
that I wanted to kind of touch on is that place of individuality. So yeah, that was a good thing to talk about. I don't really have
Yeah.
any other general overarching topics that I gathered from what I have read of the paper.
Yeah, we could we could maybe go down a metaphysics rabbit hole
Hmm.
for a while, but I think that's far off topic from uh I've been doing a lot of reading on various uh, philosophies and things recently, but um
I think actually
that's
studying philosophy has killed my love completely. Killed it dead.
oh no.
Yeah, it's terrible. Don't ever study philosophy.
I think it depends where I think it depends where you land in your perspective on what reality is and what it means to be, and how we can understand and measure that. But for me, I think it's enriched my understanding, especially c- coming from sort of deconversion of Christianity and having that built in. meaning. I think studying various and finding where I land in that, who am I, what is the world, what is how do we understand reality, what is it at bottom, where do we, by what means do we create systems of ethics and that kind of thing, has for me been a saving grace. I think I do have a friend, in contrast, I have a friend who around the same time deconverted from Christianity and went the nihilistic route and was quite depressed for quite a long time. So I can understand why.
To be fair, I think that the the Nietzschean nihilistic path does seem to be the more common when it comes to deconversion.
Yeah.
But I think as far as the passion towards philosophy and the concept of studying it or not studying it, I think a distinction should be made between, studying it in an organic sense where you kind of are interested in it and you look up stuff
Right.
and then you
Yes.
jump to another topic that catches your mind,
Yeah.
and you go from piece to piece in a non-rigorous, non-structured fashion is going to be a very different and lead to a different appreciation than being
Oh yeah.
forced, right? If you're being forced to go through a curriculum where you have to step through the various philosophers and their points and counterpoints and their
Yeah.
evolution over time, I mean, philosophy is an immensely rich topic, and there are plenty of things that you can find great pleasure in, and plenty of things that are absolutely maddening. Like, what are you talking about? How can you believe that? How can you think that? But you have to struggle through that if you're trying to get a rigorous understanding of the evolution of philosophies and the arguments and counter arguments that have been the through line of the entire endeavor. Whereas, so that would be the academic side, and it's very easy. Really, anything when you study in a rigorous academic, it gives you that good foundation, but it is harder sometimes to maintain the pleasure and joy of
Yes.
that sense of discovery. Where when you do it on your own, you maintain that joy, but there's oftentimes the downside, of course, is the huge gaps. Is you've missed things. You'll come to
Right. Yeah.
conclusions. You do think you have this epiphany, but that's been, if you did the rigorous thing, that epiphany was something that's been mulled over and
Yeah.
pointed and counterpointed and disputed forever, and is almost a mute point in the greater modern idea of philosophy now.
Yeah.
So I used to be rather, when I was much younger, I used to be quite an objectivist.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we grow out of that phase. We all kind of have to.
Yeah.
That's my opinion, anyhow. And more, I just say, qui sais-je? What the hell do I know? I just keep referring back to that. I try and find logical conclusions to things, and then just end qui sais-je?
Yeah. I was initially very into sort of epiphenomenalism and uh, philosophical positivism after I deconverted from Christianity, because it is very much that sort of like reductionist understanding of the theory of everything, and it sort of simplifies everything, but and sort of accepting that reality and what it means to be alive is far more complex than that is difficult to struggle through, I think.
But you got to feel the horror of vacui, the fear of nothingness, emptiness.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. Well, on that note, Genevieve, where would you like people to find you? Would you like to share your model page or academic pages, or what would you like?
Well, I'm not very active online. I should be more. However, you
Well,
can find me on Facebook. That's just you. I have a very distinct name, so just type in Van Vedder. You'll find me.
thank you so much for coming on, for sharing all that. That was really tremendous, really incredible, and I'm very glad that and this is something I'm trying to focus on this year, actually, but I'm glad to get a different cultural perspective. I think it's very easy for, at least for myself and probably the stereotype of Americans, to focus on an American or Western perspective of everything. And I think it's important to share how the world doesn't work like that, and it doesn't revolve around our own experiences. So thank you for taking the time to share your research with us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. It was a joy.
Thank you.
The preceding program is a member of the Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.